St. Paul is speaking of armaments this morning in the lesson from Ephesians. He says that we need to invest ourselves with every bit of defensive armor we can find. And in fact, the things that he mentions are actual bits of armor that Roman soldiers would have worn during that time and would have used during that time. The armor that the private soldiers who had some money to be able to buy their armor wore were rather like shoulder pads that football players wear. But instead of having plastic and padding, they were made out of bent sheets of metal, probably steel, and they were layered. And then they also had a breastplate which covered them around in here so that that part of their body would be protected. And they wore a helmet that was made out of metal that had a lip on the back so that the enemy couldn't cut them on the back of their neck. That sort of served as a neck protector kind of thing. They also had shoes, but that's how it is written in our lesson, but it's actually boots. They had boots, leather boots that were ankle high, and they had hobnails on the bottom so they wouldn't wear out. They also had a shield, and on their shield sometimes were put what amounted to lawn darts. But they were about 5 pounds and they had a very sharp point on the front. And if you could manage to hit someone with that point with a lawn dart, they were done for. You also had a sword, which was a short sword, probably about that long. And with those items, you could pretty much go on the offense or the defense, which is what the writer of Ephesians is telling us. He doesn't say, onward Christian soldiers, and go out there and conquer everybody. He says mostly, protect yourselves against the evil that is out there. And in those days, of course, the time this would have been written, the church was beginning to be persecuted. Any church or any religious group that says you eat the body and blood of the Savior of your religion, we don't know about cannibalism, you know? That's what the authorities were saying. What is this? This has got to be illegal, and we're going to make it illegal. Of course, they misunderstood what was happening, but nonetheless, once the rumor gets started, you know, it can be halfway around the world by the time you try to stop a rumor, right? So they were having to protect themselves. The thing about this armor, though, was that it was flexible. It wasn't like armor like in the later and high Renaissance, when the body was almost completely covered with metal. This armor was light, and a person could move with it and pivot and easily avoid many of the sword swipes that were coming at them. However, but when we move ahead in time to the late Renaissance, we find our friend Henry VIII, and boy did he have some armor. This was the kind of armor that was head to foot. And his first set of armor had a 34-inch waist, and his chest was around 40 inches, a lot smaller than I am. Anyway, that armor weighed about 97 pounds. So we talk about soldiers having very heavy packs that they have to carry their stuff around with them. Imagine them having to carry that with a 97-pound set of armor on them. Well, the next set of armor that was made for Henry VIII was when he was 28 years old, and he had a 36-inch waist. So it was that much heavier and more cumbersome to wear. And then by the time he was 29 years old, his waist was 38 inches. Now his armor is getting up toward 125 pounds, 130 pounds, something like that. And when he's 48 years old, his last set of armor was 51 inches in the waist. I am 51 inches in the waist. So we're talking about armor that weighs something on the order of 200 pounds. So pity the poor horse that he was riding on, right? It had to be a Percheron, that was one of these French horses that was really big. And don't you know, they had to use a crane to lift him up onto the horse because he couldn't climb up. Now this is the opposite of something that you can really use and be nimble and quick on the field, that you can get in and out and do the work that you need to do to go on offense or defense. This is not the kind of armor, of course, that I believe the writer of Ephesians is talking about. The writer of Ephesians is talking about defensive armor mostly. He's not worried about having to go out and kill people. That's not the point. Because the sword that Christians carry forward is the word of the love of God in the spirit of love and communion and compassion, reaching out to others, not with a sword so much as with the helmet turned over to offer water to a lot of thirsty and fighting people. That's what it's about. Now, that heavy armor had to become heavier and heavier because the weapons of the time, the technology developed along with the armor, along with the defensive armor. So in the beginning, they could wear lightweight armor, but then they started developing these darts and these spears, and then crossbows, and then came gunpowder. And when gunpowder comes on the scene, no more armor anymore. The weapons are too powerful. The weapons in our day have become very powerful. They are not always physical, military-style weapons. They are weapons of the Spirit, literally, that come upon us, that come upon our society and say, I have it better than you, I'm more entitled than you are. I have the correct political ideology, and when those things come flying at you, as they come flying at me, as they may have with you, what can we do? When I was living in Las Vegas, a person that I met there who was a member of the church, perfectly lovely woman, nice in all respects, and don't you know, the moment something political came up, I never heard a harangue like that in my life. 25 minutes of an harangue. Not a word in edgewise, and I disagree with every bit of it. She was on the attack. I've learned a little better now how to deal with that. I just don't talk to them. Or I say something like, if you're a Christian, is God love or is God not love? If God is love, then how can anybody be excluded? If God is love, how can anyone be excluded? How can you say that you're better than somebody else, or you're more deserving or more entitled? But that's way too logical. That makes way too much rational sense. So, I don't talk very much. Unless there's a certain person that can say, well, yeah, unless a person's capable of being reflective, then maybe we can talk to them and find some common ground and some ways to talk. I remember back after Reconstruction was stopped and all the federal soldiers that had enforced Reconstruction were called back, then the white establishment was able to come back and take over the political process from South Carolina and elsewhere, and Jim Crow became instituted. Before then, I'm told, that poor blacks and poor whites worked together, all sharecroppers, to do what they could to help each other along. I don't know the exact forms that took, but I know it to be true, that there was not animosity between these two, because they recognized that it was the haves that were the problem, not the have-nots. They were the have-nots. It seems to me that something similar is happening in this case, that someone has divided the black community, persons of color, over against whites, who are, just by virtue of being white, privileged. And once again, poor whites and poor blacks, persons of color, are being separated from each other. Rather than make common political cause, they're starting to look down on each other and fight with each other. This is appalling to all of us who recognize what is going on. Our defense is to simply call this out whenever we can. Online, on Facebook, when talking with other people, to say, God is love. God is not about rules. God is not about earning His favor. God is not about being correct, having correct political ideology. It's about love. And so we as the church have love as our, quote, weapon. That's what we take out into the world with us. And it's also, however, that sword that also discerns truth from falsehood, that can go forward and say, if it's not about love, it's not about God. That sword makes that demarcation. It's the line that we can say it's either this or that. And that's not being judgmental, it's judging others with the judgment that we ourselves want to be judged by. Scripture says, do not judge. But what it means when you line it out a little further and explain it is, the way you judge others will be the way that you are judged. In other words, do we love them with compassion? Do we see them not as competitors, but as brothers and sisters with us? If someone says, that's not my brother or sister, then that's not about love. And so we simply stand and witness to that, whether in words or in actions. That's what we're called to do. Now, as mentioned earlier, or I'm going to go a little further, actually. There's one thing about armor, that armor, such as we're talking about in this lesson, protects us from outside things, from insults and unjust criticisms and so forth. But there's a problem with armor, and that is that armor can keep us constrained within ourselves, so that we can't move and change and develop because we're crowded inside of this exoskeleton, let's call it. When actually, some of the things that keep us from growing into the image of God as God intended us to grow are because we can't get out of our armor. Like Henry VIII outgrew his armor, we outgrow our armor also in the best possible way, in the ways of the Spirit. The things that contain us and keep us from growing are many, one of which is religion itself. If I see myself as a Christian and different from others, then I'm rigid. If I see others as not being worthy of God's care and attention, then I'm rigid. If I only see God as acting in certain ways, then I'm stuck inside myself. If I'm rigidly inside my armor, then maybe I don't have to look inside myself to see the ways in which I am working against myself through lack of faith, lack of knowledge, lack of understanding. So here's what I say. Take off the armor. We don't need armor anymore. We don't need armor anymore. We don't need to protect ourselves because, God is there within us, providing us with everything that we need for defense and in order to go out and to spread the message that God is love. So, the description in Ephesians is very good, particularly for its time. But I suggest that we need to take off our armor, to let it go, to beat our sword into a plowshare, to set our shields aside, and simply walk forward into the world with the love of Christ. Will it be easy? No. Will you get thumped pretty hard by people who don't believe as you do? Yes. But every strength, everything, every spirit, every hope, all the energy that we need is within us. So I'm going to take up my helmet and turn it over. I'm going to try to turn it into a cup to carry some cold water out there. There's a lot of thirsty people in the world that are thirsting for something like love.